So, here we are in the middle of December, in the midst of cold season. So bear with me today. I have my water. I have a Ricola. And let's see what happens. We're in the middle of Advent, and during this month we're walking through the book of Jonah. And last week we considered the word hope and Jonah's resistance to hope being something for him and for his neighbors. And today we want to focus in on Jonah and peace, or the more expansive term, shalom. Shalom is the word that Scripture uses to describe the world as God longs for it to be. A web of right relationships between people and God, neighbor to neighbor, humanity and creation, and even within our own lives. I'm just wondering if I should change mics. Should I? Are we okay? All right. So this is not a quiet peace. This is not something that comes simply from avoiding conflict, but it's a deep peace that comes from healing that which is broken, restoring that which is lost, mending what is torn, and putting all things back together again. Shalom is wholeness within us, between us, and around us. And this is not a word that I would say describes Jonah throughout the book. Instead, we find that he is defined by unrest. He's defined by this inner turmoil and confusion. He's disturbed by what he sees around him and all of the ways it appears that his enemies are winning and his own people are suffering as a result. And he wants God to make things right, but he wants God to do this according to his norms and his ideals, according to his ways of thinking. And so Jonah imagines that his distorted prayer for peace, his distorted prayer for shalom, is justified when he prays something like this: "May my enemies receive the punishment that they deserve." After all, will this not be what makes all things right, especially where those he despises are concerned? For them to be left undone, for them to be left defeated, for them to be the ones who do not rise to glory, and for his people to rise instead. And so God's invitation to speak judgment over Nineveh, those who inhabit the capital of Assyria, the very country that has tormented them, taken from them, and divided them, is met with resistance. Not because he doesn't wish retribution, but rather because he cannot tolerate mercy. He doesn't want mercy for people like that. Jonah rejects God's mission and finds himself traveling in the opposite direction of Nineveh, making it clear to God that he's not going to participate in the redemption of those who have never sought the redemption of people like him. And so if Jonah was a man of unrest prior to him to go to Nineveh, how much more is he unsettled after hearing God's words to go to Nineveh? And so as he enters the ship that's going to take him far from his enemies, he does what so many of us do when we find ourselves in places of internal conflict and confusion, with a little bit of mental dissonance and some ethical curiosity. He simply goes to sleep. He finds his way into this deep sleep. Because sometimes it's just easier sleeping than dealing with that stuff that's going on deep within him and that which is happening outside of him. The author of Jonah gives us a picture of this unrest as we are given a picture of the sea turning violent, and it becomes volatile and turbulent, and the ship is being moved from side to side. Jonah's inner world is mirrored by the ocean, and it will be this tumult that leads Jonah to face his unrest rather than to simply try and sleep it off. And so as the sailors get worried, as they question him and his God, Jonah offers a kind of confession. He says, all of this unrest in the ocean, everything that you're seeing is because of the unrest within me. The storm is my fault. Just throw me into the sea. Jonah recognizes that he and God are at odds with one another, and that his attempts to be made invisible have left him with the reminder that it is only possible to be found by God and impossible to hide from God. And so Jonah in his unrest, Jonah in his dissonance, Jonah in the midst of his unsettled inner world, he does not suddenly succumb to God's request, but remains defiantly opposed as he offers the sailor a grim and dark ending to his story. Okay, I need something else. Sorry, guys. I'm just going to take. Yeah, it's on. Hello? All right. All right. There. Nice and clear. So, Jonah tells them to throw him into the sea, and Jonah recognizes that he and God are at odds with one another, and that his attempts to be made invisible have left him with that reminder that one cannot indeed hide from God. And so Jonah, in this season of unrest, in this season of dissonance, in the midst of everything that's unsettled within him, he does not suddenly succumb to God's request, but remains defiantly opposed as he offers the sailors this grim and dark ending to his story. So it's here that we have to note that Jonah is not quite different from other prophets. Almost every prophet is reluctant to speak on God's behalf. But in this scenario, Jonah is different. Because Jonah, in his reluctance, does not point himself towards God, but instead moves himself away from God, to somehow attempt to be forgotten by God. And so while other prophets in this situation might engage in conversation, they will tell God they're unfit, they're unwilling, they're afraid. But Jonah chooses silence, and Jonah chooses retreat. From the time that God speaks to Jonah in the first verse of the first chapter, Jonah is silent. Jonah doesn't protest. Jonah doesn't make a request. He doesn't plead with God for mercy or bring forward a case for leaving Nineveh behind, for saving the sailors from the sea, or even to justify his own rejection of his calling. Instead, Jonah pulls himself further and further into his own unrest, into his own inner undoing, his own personal chaos. And rather than confront God or speak to God or lean into God, he simply pulls away and left only with his own wisdom, his own intuition, his own sense of what must be done. And then he reacts out of this unrest that plagues him rather than going to the God that surrounds him. He reacts to the words of God by running away. He reacts to all that he knows is tied with his actions with avoidance. And he reacts to the sailor's request with confusion and ambivalence. He reacts to God's wind-filled reminder that he is found with a request to be thrown into the sea in his pursuit of equilibrium, in his quest for peace. And his desire for shalom, he chooses the certainty of death rather than the uncertainty of joining with where God is moving. Erica Brown notes that because Jonah realized that he had no possible escape from his destiny as prophet, he came to accept death as the only viable alternative to an eventual return of calm. And so once again, moving on his own, in his own direction, Jonah is enveloped by the dangerous sea, who has grown calm on the surface, but is now fighting against Jonah. And still, no conversation, no prayer, no call for help, nothing, and Jonah is then swallowed by this fish. And depending on how you read the text, it appears Jonah, in the disorientation and darkness of what must have felt like a grave. The end of chapter 1 says that Jonah was inside the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. And then chapter 2 begins with the declaration, then Jonah prayed to the Lord from inside the fish. And so it could be said that even there in the pit, even there in the dark, in the belly of a fish, even there in the midst of what must have felt like death, the end of all things for him, the culmination of his unrest, even there, Jonah is resistant to lean into God. Until somehow it becomes evident that perhaps the very reason he is still breathing, the very reason he is still living, still able to feel the unrest within him, is that God has not left him. Rather, God resides with him. Regardless of all the ways that Jonah has walked away, everything that Jonah has rejected and resisted, God at work in the world is still there. This is good news for Jonah. This is good news for us. That regardless of where we have been or what we've avoided or the things we've left undone, God is still there. God remains. And so after 3 days of disorientation and 3 days of sitting in the midst of filth and 3 days of wondering if this is death, 3 days of darkness, 3 days of stillness, Jonah finally succumbs to prayer. Some like to picture this moment as Jonah's time in the fish as Jonah being reborn. Some speak to it as this season of personal transformation. And while these are interesting frames of reference, yet apart from the physical changes, Jonah doesn't demonstrate any kind of significant internal transformation. Jonah doesn't leave this moment of being within a fish remorseful. Jonah is not suddenly on board with what God is doing. His views of his neighbors as strangers and enemies is not unchanged. In Jonah chapter 2, Jonah laments. He begs God to rescue him. He wonders if he will ever find his way back to the place of worship. He recounts his dive into the sea and attributes God with his downfall, but he also attributes God with his rescue. And then he reminds God why he ran away in the first place, why he resists going to Nineveh, why he is right and why God is somehow misguided. He says, those who worship false gods turn their back on all of God's mercies, but I will offer sacrifice. I will fulfill all of my vows. And so if there is any change that Jonah says, it's this. He says, sure, I'll go. I'll go to Nineveh. After all, who can compete with a God who sends fish to swallow me? Who holds me up in the ocean, who keeps me alive for 3 days and 3 nights. But his words about all those who worship false gods is this reminder to God that despite his running away, despite his resistance and his refusal to lean into God, all of it is justified because at least he is not like them. Jonah announces, at least I am not like the sailors and their false gods. At least I am not like the Ninevites and their violence. At least I am better than them. Erica Brown notes that the sailors may have sacrificed to God in their moment of thanksgiving, but they could not possibly have meant what Jonah meant with his offering. Jonah believed that only his transformation was valid when, ironically, his prayer lacked the commitment to transformation. His change was more superficial than those that he criticized in his prayer. Yet even in the midst of Jonah's arrogance, in the midst of his lack of repentance, in the midst of his non-existent remorse, God is not finished. God doesn't walk away. God does not leave him in the fish. God does not suddenly cause Jonah to die. Instead, we encounter the God of Shalom. God still invites Jonah to walk towards wholeness. He still invites Jonah to participate in his mission. He still saves Jonah from that which could destroy him. He still has mercy on Jonah despite the lack of mercy that Jonah has on others. And while we may have been wondering about Jonah's longing for and Jonah's waiting for peace, instead I am reminded of Jesus' announcement, "Blessed are the peacemakers." Those peculiar words that Jesus offers to the crowds during the famed Sermon on the Mount. This unusual blessing. Blessed are those who pursue peace. Blessed are those who shape peace, who help breathe peace into existence. And Jonah, as we read it in the text, is not one who pursues peace. He's not one who is shaped by it. He's not one who goes after it. In fact, he resists it. He resists peace within himself and outside of himself. He belittles the pursuit of peace. He does not wish to participate in peace as fullness and wholeness and renewal for all people. Waiting for peace neither defines who he is, nor does it define what he longs for in relation to others. Instead, as I encounter Jonah, I encounter God as a peacemaker. We encounter a God who patiently waits. We encounter a God who is patiently present. We encounter a God who patiently pursues and who patiently seeks to shape and breathe peace into who Jonah is and to who Jonah becomes and those whom Jonah will encounter. And so while Jonah's story, from the raging waters to the belly of the fish and then vomited onto dry land, is often characterized as a picture of him being reborn and brought back to life, I wonder if it is more accurately a picture of all of the spaces and all of the situations and all of the places that the God who is a peacemaker journeys in the pursuit of Jonah being made whole. For God seems to go along with Jonah when Jonah is afraid, when Jonah is resistant, when Jonah is despondent, when Jonah is defiant and arrogant and reluctant. Yet in each of those situations, God remains consistent. God continues to pursue, to shape, and breathe peace as he walks alongside Jonah and invites him to experience shalom and to participate in it, even though Jonah resists every step of the way. And suddenly, this becomes less about a man who falters. It becomes less about a prophet who missteps or one who is antagonistic to God's mission in the world, and instead becomes the story that better helps us to understand who God is and what God is like. And thus it becomes our own twofold mission to follow in those footsteps. First, to consider all of the spaces, to consider all of the experiences, all of the places and moments where we were, or perhaps where we find ourselves today, where we are like Jonah. Where we find ourselves fearful, where we find ourselves arrogant and dismissive and resistant to who God is or to what God is doing, or the sense that God isn't doing enough. And this invitation is to consider all of the times we have sought to perhaps put aside our own story and our own history with God, to let go of the conversations that we've had with God, the promises we've heard from God, to ignore the calling that has been placed on us, to reject the word spoken over us and to us, and then to find ourselves reminded that even there, even in those spaces and those places and those situations, God remains consistent. God remains present. God was and is still a peacemaker in your situation, in your heart, in your story, pursuing, shaping, and breathing peace for you, seeking your wholeness, for that is who a peacemaking God is. And so for those of us who find ourselves in the midst of unrest, whether internal or external, self-imposed or externally inflicted, such as Noah, know that our God, who is a peacemaker, is actively pursuing and longing for shalom to define you. And regardless of where you are or where you've been, God waits with longing for you to know them as a peacemaker. One who brings all of the pieces together, one who seeks that you would experience peace that is defined by wholeness and completeness, that you would be so at rest that you can lean into and live out you who you have always been created to be. And secondly, for those who have experienced this relentless pursuit of peace, for those of us who have experienced this peacemaker God, who both is and who offers shalom, the second invitation springs from the first. And that is that we are called to be a conduit of that same peace, this same shalom among our neighbors. We are called to be that same kind of peace among those who are strangers. We are called to be that same kind of peace among those who may even be like enemies. For this is how we participate in God's vision and God's mission, in God's dream for all of us. For those like Jonah, for those like you and me, for those whom we cannot name, and those whom we do not know. And so for those whose experience has been to encounter the God of shalom, this God who seeks your wholeness, this God who is a peacemaker, I want to invite you to lean into the passage that we heard earlier today, Isaiah 11, 1-10, which is this vision of God as a peacemaker, forming a world where life springs from that which seems lifeless, that which appears to be cut down. A world where that which is violent and unpredictable is tempered and made gentle and accessible. A vision of justice arriving with fairness, even for the most vulnerable and those most easy to exclude. A picture of harm undone, peace reigning, hope present, all because the God who is the peacemaker is the one who reigns. And so, this is what you and I get to join God in making manifest. Shalom, brought to life in the spaces where you have influence. Shalom brought to life among the stories of those we encounter and in the places where we are led and invited to be an incarnate presence of peace. One of the best examples of this that I could kind of think about for this week is a story, and you might know of him already, of Father Gregory Boyle. Is anyone familiar? Other than those who are professors and stuff. You don't get to raise your hands for things. So Father Boyle is a Catholic priest, and in the late 80s, he was assigned to Dolores Mission Church in Los Angeles. And when he was there, he arrives to one of the poorest parishes in the city, and at the time, the epicenter of gang violence. There were shootings that happened daily. There was homicides that were higher than the rest of the state. And there were 8 active gangs that were terrorizing the community. And so Father Boyle arrives, and he has to make a choice. Does he keep everything as it is, calling the police daily, keeping kids quiet and off of their property, complaining about the state of the neighborhood, or does he choose to become a presence of peace? And so we ask the question, what is God calling us to do here? And he began to get to know his neighbors, who were gang members, and to ask better questions. The first being, what is needed most? And over again, he heard the same answer. And guess what it wasn't? It wasn't Bible studies. It wasn't prayer meetings. It wasn't an extra service. But the answer was a job. People said over and over again, we need employment. And so out of this, he began an employment project that sought to bring gang members into jobs throughout the community and eventually resulted in the beginning of what would later be called Homeboy Industries, which I doubt you would call it in 2025, but in 1980 it made sense, which is responsible for the transformation of communities all over. And so this became a story of hundreds of gang members and the restitution of a neighborhood, the restitution of families and communities. And so this initial initiative resulted in gang members working side by side, violence in neighborhoods dropping, economic stability rising, and individuals flourishing as they experienced structure and dignity and being encountered as humans rather than as a threat. This was just the beginning of the work that they started. This was just the beginning of what it looked like to offer peace within a neighborhood, within families, and within the lives of individuals. And by the end of what he was doing, there were some who would come to him and say, "You were the first person who saw me as more than what I had done." Now, not every story of embodied shalom is going to be as grand as that. They're not all going to look like that, nor may they be as well known or as documented. The places where you are invited, the spaces where you take notice of God at work and sense that this is where God is asking you to join in with what they are doing, may not be the same. But all of them require something similar. They all require courage. Courage to see, courage to believe that God is at work, and courage to respond as the Spirit leads. Even when it is far easier, even when it makes far more sense, even when it is far more convenient and comfortable to just walk away. And courage to prayerfully join in the beautiful work of extending to others what God first extended to you. Jonah, the prophet in need of peace, is never left alone. Rather, God is the presence of peace to him when he knows it and when he can't imagine it. We, the ones in need of peace, are never left alone. Rather, God is the presence of peace when we know it and can identify it, and when we cannot even imagine it. And we, the ones who have experienced God as our peacemaker, the one who took pieces and made us whole again, the one who whispered that despite what others had spoken, we are made complete. And the God who is at work in our stories and has been is present throughout our journey. And so for those of us who have found ourselves in the presence of the God who is peace, the God who is our peacemaker, my prayer is that we would be a people who are known for how to multiply peace. That we would be known for people who know how to carry peace and to offer peace, to whisper peace, and are a presence of peace right where we are led, right where God invites us to join them in the beautiful work of shalom. I'll ask the worship team to come up. So wherever you find yourself, Wherever you see yourself, whether on the waves, whether it's in the darkness, or whether it's on the shore, may you know this: the God of peace is already present. And as that peace takes root in you, may you become that seed of shalom in the places that God sends you. This quiet and beautiful sign of the world that God is bringing to life. Amen. So I'm not sure if some of you are familiar with an author named Kate Bowler. And in one of her books, she talks a lot about grief and loss and things that challenging situations. So really moments of unrest, moments when peace is lacking. And she tells the story of when her own journey through cancer and how all the kinds of letters and words that she would receive from people that were less than comforting, but more felt like she had to accomplish something, or she had to learn a lesson, or she had to become a better person out of what was really, really a terrible moment for her. And she said, the letters that stood out to her the most, the ones that brought her the most hope, were the ones that told stories about where, in their own situations of unrest, is who they recognized was with them. And so people would send all types of stories to her about great moments of tragedy or catastrophe or loss. And they would talk about this experience of love being surrounding them, this experience of peace surrounding them. And she said in all of those stories, that is what stood out. And so as we go into this week with the unrest that is around us, within us, my prayer and my blessing for you is that you would be reminded not so much of what it is that is around you, what is coming in against you, what feels like unrest and what is hopeless or what cannot be achieved through peace, but instead that you would be consistently reminded throughout the week in small and in big ways of the God who is a peacemaker, who is present with you in the midst of it. And so as you go into this week as a people who perhaps experience unrest, I hope you also experience the God who is our peace. Amen.